So, greetings, and this is the lecture about chapter 20 in the book, in your textbook, which covers several huge continents and vast eras of time. And, I can't, it's a huge amount of material, and to keep this lecture to a reasonable length, I kind of had to limit the things that I'm talking about today. So this is just consider this lecture to be a supplement to the text and not a substitute for your own research into these matters. There's some more content in the e-learn part of your course. So mostly from the Khan Academy, which is a great resource for learning about this, basically what we're calling non-Western art, which is kind of a strange designation. Like, I think I may have said in the other lecture, west of what? So Western culture, though, for the purposes of art history, just means European culture, so to speak. Europe used to be considered the West because it's to the west of Asia and of Asia. It's to the north of Africa and obviously to the east of the Americas. So it's kind of weird to call European Western art or talk about Western culture being the same as European culture, but that's just how it went down. So your book sort of focuses, well, it does focus on European art of Europe and the Americas, you could say, until it gets to the very end when it talks about the global art. And what we're talking about in this lecture is global art before the 20th and 21st century. So obviously people were making art all over the world for tens of thousands of years, and some of it has survived and some of it hasn't. And what I'm talking about today is art that has survived from North America and Africa, a few objects from each continent. And this is just scratching the surface of an enormous topic, obviously, which I'm still learning about. So let's all keep learning about it. This is by no means a definitive lecture about North American pre-Columbian art or about African art. It's just like a sort of short introduction to it. So I'm going to share my screen now. Hope you can see that. Okay. So as you can see, I left out Oceania completely. There just wasn't time for that. That's not to say it's not important or not interesting. It really is. And I looked at a lot of art from Oceania when I lived in Houston because the Menil Museum had a great collection. So look into that. It's very interesting and awesome. But I decided to kind of focus on North America since that's where we live. And the art of the people who lived in North America prior to Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean in 1492, which I'm sure you learned about at some point in your education before college. There's even a little song about it. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It was a courageous thing to do, but somebody was already here. The Inuit and Cherokee, the Aztec and Menominee, the Onondaga and the Cree. Columbus sailed across the sea, but someone was already here. Sorry, my singing is not very good. Anyway, what we call that art sometimes is pre-Columbian. That just means before Columbus came. Obviously, there's Native American art that happened after Columbus came too, but in this lecture, I'm just focusing on pre-Columbian art. Okay, so where did the people of North America come from? the original first peoples, as we say. They came from Asia, and they came across a land bridge called Beringia, as you can see on this map. Nowadays, you'd have to use an airplane or a boat to get from Russia, which is here, to Alaska. But during the ice ages, the sea levels were much lower. And when sea levels fell due to the ice sucking up so much of the water, people could walk from what's now Russia and ultimately China to Alaska, and then from there to the rest of the United States. Now, there's some theories that it's possible that some people came across the Pacific in boats to South America or Mesoamerica. Maybe, we don't really know. And there's also evidence that Vikings arrived in North America, way over here, at some point around 1000 or 1200 of the Common Era, but they didn't stay. They left. They left some artifacts and then just went back to Iceland. Okay, so, but the original people of the Americas came from Asia and quickly spread all over North America and into South America, and were divided into many different cultures, as you could see, big groups of cultures, but then those cultures were subdivided linguistically into hundreds of languages. So, or what some people call tribes, but more correctly, it's just known as cultures. So, for example, in our part of Tennessee, there were Cherokee people. There were also Chickasaw people, not written on this map, and they shared similar languages and could presumably understand each other. But probably a lot of the original languages of the Americas only have a few speakers now and could be conceivably lost as languages. So this is a 19th century print of Native people that Europeans encountered when they first arrived. And the purpose of this is just to illustrate the wide variety of cultures that existed in North America. So there was no one culture. I mean, sometimes when you learn about Native American people, you imagine them as Plains Indians with headdresses like this. But of course, that was just one culture that lived here. And also, there's some sort of dispute about what Native people want to be called. Some Native people are fine with the word Indian. Others are not. Some people want to be called Native Americans. Some people want to be called First Nations or First Peoples. Some people just want to be called by what their own ethnicity is, like Cherokee or Chickasaw. So we're going to call them Native Americans in this lecture. All right, so within each culture of the original people who were here, there are different periods, obviously, because they've been here for tens of thousands of years. So we're going to first talk about Mississippian culture. So Mississippian culture lasted from about 800 to 1540 of the present era. And its capital was its largest city was a place called Cahokia, which is now in Illinois. I don't know if it's on this map. Yeah, here it is, Cahokia. This is Tennessee right here. And some of the artifacts we're going to talk about came from a site in Tennessee called Castalian Springs. So there are some artifacts that have been found from Mississippian culture in Tennessee. And I myself have found plenty of arrowheads. I'm not smart enough about arrowheads to tell you what culture they're from, like what era they're from, whether they're Mississippian or Clovis or whatever. The oldest arrowheads that you might find are called Clovis points. and I have one or two of those, but I didn't find them. So I found some smaller points, and I can't date them, but it'd be interesting to do so. Okay, so the first thing, sort of artwork we're going to talk about is the Great Serpent Mound, and that it's going to come up later in the course when we get to earthworks, 20th century American earthworks, because this mound, the Great Serpent Mound, influenced another artist, an American artist, who started making earthworks. But the Fort Ancient culture was sort of a subset of the Mississippian culture in Ohio. And they built this gigantic, well, it's very long. It's only about 3 feet tall. It's a serpentine mound. So it's in the shape of a snake. And it was built around 1070 of the Common Era. Weirdly, it doesn't contain any artifacts. Normally, when you find a mound like this from Mississippian culture, it's a burial mound and it contains artifacts and human remains and so on. But this one doesn't. We'll see another picture of it. Okay, so these are drawings of the Great Serpent Mound. Here's a sort of aerial view of it. And then another drawing that gives you a sense of what it looks like. So it's not entirely clear what's going on at this end of the serpent. Is this supposed to be the serpent's mouth swallowing an egg or a frog or something? Or is this the serpent's eye? So scholars don't really agree on this. To me, it does look like a snake swallowing, well, a chicken egg, which we know chicken snakes do that. I have a chicken snake that lives right out there. I saw him the other day. Hopefully he won't go to my neighbor's house and get her eggs and chickens, but they do that. So it seems plausible to me that this might be an egg, but also the head is oriented so that it faces the summer solstice sunset. So that would be in the west, sort of to the northwest. So in my house, it would be over there. And the tail is oriented towards the winter solstice sunrise, which is, my house is kind of back over there. So it's possible that this has something to do with the sun, maybe a sort of swallowing of the sun, like during an eclipse. It also was built around the time of Halley's Comet, but it doesn't really look like Halley's Comet. Anyway, Halley's Comet has just a straight tail, not a curvy tail like this. But the snake is a very important figure in the iconography of the Americas generally. So we'll see some more examples of that in a minute. Okay, so this is an aerial photograph when you can see the head of the snake, the egg or sun or whatever it is, and the coils, which some scholars say are oriented towards certain planets and constellations. So there's a lot of mystery surrounding the Serpent Mound. But it's a place where you can visit now in Ohio. So if you're ever up there, go check it out. Be very interesting. Okay, so this is an artifact that was found in Tennessee, actually, near a small town called Castellian Springs in Sumner County. And amazingly, even though Mississippian cultures didn't leave any written records, scholars have sort of pieced together what this is about, even who this is, which I think is an amazing feat. So based on the iconography, which again means the symbolism that's particular to this culture that made the object, this is a hero called Morning Star or Red Tail. And he's associated with, he's sort of like a mythic hero, like, some of the Greek gods or something. And this marking around his eyes associated with the peregrine falcon. That's one clue. And the peregrine falcons were part of this whole iconography. And there's a story where Morning Star or Red Tail goes to the underworld and retrieves the remains of his father. So that might be what this is. Or it could just be the head of an enemy that he's killed. And this is a mace, which is a kind of war instrument, like a club. And it appears that he's running. And he has a very elaborate headdress that has a bow and arrow in it. And these ear spools, which are also a common part of North American and Meso-American iconography, that signals a sort of elite person with huge ear spools, like some of the people that work at Whole Foods. That's the only place I've ever seen people with those giant ear spools. It looks really painful. Anyway, this was supposed to be worn around your neck and attached to a leather thong or a string through these holes, so that when you were wearing it, he would be looking up at the sky, which is where he was taking the remains of his father. That's part of the whole story. So it's a pretty complex set of iconographical signs, you could say, but it's all about the cosmology of the Mississippian culture, which had gods that lived in the overworld, you could say the sky, who were called the Thunderers. So when I was a kid, we had a book called The Claws of the Thunderbird that was based on sort of this whole Native American cosmology. He had some very scary illustrations in it, so I've never forgotten it. So the overworld is occupied by the Thunderbird and other figures like this red-tailed person. The middle world is where people live, people and animals. And then the underworld is where the Corn Mother lives. Ooh. So part of the stories of this mythology have to do with traveling between these worlds, which is what shamans do generally in different world myths. So you could say that Morning Star here is acting as a shaman by going between the underworld and the world of the sky, traveling between the worlds, you could say. And all these worlds were connected by a cedar tree, I found out, which made me feel a little bad because I cut a gigantic one down about a month ago. Oh, well. So the tree that a sort of pole or a tree that connects all three of the worlds, the overworld, the middle world, and the underworld, is also a common piece of iconography all over the world. It's called axis mundi. That is the axis of the world, the sort of imaginary pole that actually does. There is a sort of imaginary pole that goes through the earth, the magnetic poles, right? And so ancient people, before they even knew about that, sort of imagined this pole that connected the overworld, the world of humans, and the underworld. Maybe that's the Festivus pole too, or could be. You could imagine that a Christmas tree represents something like that. Okay, so here's an artist's conception of this mythic hero of the Mississippian culture, Morning Star or Red Tail, with all his regalia and his headdress and his ear spools, his mace, and some poor person's head, maybe his father, but maybe one of his enemies. And then there's pictographs and cave paintings that represent him. And this is his representation as Red Tail. He apparently he's imagined as having red hair that he has in a kind of ponytail. Okay, so this Mississippian culture is called this, the iconography is part of the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. And there's people who study this is like a whole field of study to understand all the myths and art of this culture. And you can see, here's some of the sites where things have been. Here's the Serpent Mound, here's Cahokia, well, they didn't put, Etowah, that's in East Tennessee, and that other Castalian Springs isn't on here, but maybe it's a minor site. Okay, so you can also visit the capital city, you could say, of Mississippian culture in around the year 1000 was Cahokia. And you can visit Cahokia and see the mounds there, the temple mounds that the Cahokians built, the Mississippian people built. So these were earthenware mounds, and at the top there were structures, wooden structures erected, which could have been temples or other kinds of buildings. This is an artist's conception of what the Kincaid site maybe looked like, with buildings erected on top of the mounds. So you may sort of wonder, why in the world would people go to the trouble of raising these mounds to build their house on? And what I suspect is that it had something to do with the fact that these cultures, there's a reason it's called Mississippian culture. It was sort of based on the Mississippi River and its tributaries, all the other rivers like the Ohio River, and ultimately the Cumberland River goes into the Ohio and then into the Mississippi. So there was this vast watershed of of land that is kind of flood prone. I mean, it certainly is here at my house. My house is on a creek that ultimately goes to Roaring River and then Spring Creek and then, a couple of other places before it gets to the Mississippi and finally all the way down to the Gulf. So if you're growing corn, beans, and squash, which was the main crops of the Mississippian people, you might be living in a flood prone area, and maybe this was just to keep your house above the floodwaters. Possibly that's my theory. I've never read that anywhere, but certainly if I wanted to keep my garden down in that bottom, I eventually moved it up here to the house because it flooded all the time down there. But I could have just gotten some people, I guess, or some earth moving equipment and built me a mound and then put the house on top of that. But there was already a mound here. So I just built my house above the floodplain area. So that's one theory, my theory about the mounds. Okay, so, but the interesting thing is that when you think about North America, when we think about it now, here's North America, Tennessee's right here, and here's the Rio Grande River, and we think of Mesoamerica, that is Mexico, Honduras, Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, as being sort of separate, but obviously in the period we're talking about, there was no border, right? And certainly no wall. And anybody could walk. There's plenty of places where you can wade the Rio Grande. It's not that hard to get across. I mean, in some places it's only maybe 15 feet wide and it's pretty shallow. So people were traveling from our part of North America to Mesoamerica. There were trade routes and even roads that went from North America into Mesoamerica. And so people in our part of Tennessee were connected culturally with people in Mexico and Guatemala and Belize. And the reason we know that is that things that they produced in Mexico have been found at sites in North America and vice versa. So there was apparently trade and cultural exchange going on between the Native American cultures of Mexico and of North America. And I think it's really interesting that one of the most impressive sites of ancient Mesoamerica has this same mound structure as the Mississippian culture did, but instead of being made out of earth, they're made out of stone. So they're much more permanent and very impressive. So this is a site called Teotihuacan in Mexico, not too far from Mexico City, I think. I've never been there, and maybe you have, but I would like to go there someday. It's an ancient city that had already been abandoned by the time the Aztecs came to Mexico. So the Aztecs moved to Mexico sometime around 1300 AD or whatever, and founded Mexico, built Mexico City, and they built similar mounds like this. But they found this site, Teotihuacan, and didn't know who built it or exactly who the people were or anything like that. But you can see it's the same kind of structure as the Cahokian mounds, and undoubtedly there were wooden structures on top of these mounds. This one's called the Pyramid of the Sun, and this is called the Avenue of the Dead by the Aztecs. They made up these names. And the other end of the Avenue of the Dead has the Pyramid of the Moon. So those are huge pyramids in this ancient city of Teotihuacan. And there's also another smaller pyramid called the Pyramid of Quetzalcoatl. And the reason I put this slide in here is it contains another image of a serpent. So Quetzalcoatl is right here, and Quetzalcoatl is a feathered serpent god. That is, it's a snake, but it can fly. Sort of like the dragons in Game of Thrones, maybe. And as such, it could go from the middle world where we live, Middle Earth, to the sky. So I'm sure you're recognizing all these ideas that are common not only to North American mythology, but also to other mythologies, like Tolkien called his world Middle Earth, right? So these are ideas that you could call them archetypes. That's what Jung would have called them. Jung was a theorist who lived, a German theorist of the late 19th and early 20th century, a sort of contemporary of Freud, and sometimes friend and sometimes kind of enemy of Freud. But Jung was the first person to really theorize this idea of archetypes that exist all over the world, like the axis mundi or the flying serpent, Now this other god over here with the sort of buck teeth, scholars are not sure who that is. They say it might be a rain god called Tlaloc, Tlaloc. That's kind of loosely associated with Quetzalcoatl. And there's 160 of these feathered serpent heads on this temple. So you can see the heads stick out all over the place on this temple. And in fact, there's 260 of them. And that must mean something because the calendar, the ancient calendar of Teotihuacan, and also of the Maya and other people from Central America, has 206. There are two calendars, the regular 365-day solar calendar, but then there's this other calendar called the ritual calendar that sort of overlaps in a complicated way the regular calendar, and it has 260 days, and those are sort of ritual days apparently. So there's 260 of these heads, and there's a place to put a candle, they think, or some kind of light that they would move from head to head to indicate where they were in the ritual calendar. Now, all this is very complicated, and I'm just beginning to understand it. So if you think it doesn't make sense, that may be because I need to research it more and figure it all out more. But then this lecture would stretch on for 3 or 4 hours. So you can just, if you hear something that you think is interesting, just start researching it on your own, like that 260-day calendar thing. And maybe you can figure it out and explain it to me. Okay, so now this is kind of terrible, but we're leaving Teotihuacan, which is a very interesting site that I could talk about probably for another hour, but I'm going to, in the interest of covering some other things, I'm going to go back to North America now. to the part of, this is what's called the Four Corners area of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. And in this area, there are several sites having to do with another North American culture that was kind of later than Teotihuacan, but contemporaneous with Mississippian culture. And that is the Chacoan culture. Now, I do know a little bit about Chaco Canyon because I actually went there one time. And I think I showed you a picture of Canyon de Chelly when we were talking about photography and Timothy O'Sullivan's photograph of Canyon de Chelly. But there's a lot of other sites in this part of North America, in the American West, that were all connected by roads, and they were connected culturally and linguistically. And we're going to talk about Mesa Verde. And this, I haven't actually been to Mesa Verde, but it's similar to Chaco Canyon culturally in the way it was built. So these are what are called the cliff dwellings of the people who are called now the Anasazi. And the word Anasazi means several things to the Hopi and Navajo people who now live in that part of North America. It means ancestor, but it also means enemy, apparently. So the Anasazi were the ancestors, we think, of the Hopi and the Navajo, contemporary Hopi and Navajo people. And the Anasazi built these apartment houses, really, sometimes under the shelter of an overhanging rock, like at Mesa Verde. And they're elaborate structures that they're made out of stone and mud mortar. So before that and into the present, the same group of people build adobe structures. So I do know a little bit about adobe, having actually built something with adobe in Texas when I lived there. And adobe is a mixture of mud and straw and animal manure and sometimes animal hair that you mix together and you pour into a kind of form, and you dry it in the sun, and it makes a kind of a brick. And then you make a mortar out of the same type things, and you stick them together and put a roof over it. And as long as it stays dry, it's pretty permanent. So people build houses that way all over the Southwest and in Mexico now, usually with a tin roof. But you could have a thatch roof over it, and it would, as long as the walls, the adobe doesn't get rained on too much, it's pretty permanent. But the Chacoan culture people and the Mesa Verde people started building with stone, with shaped stone, chiseled stone. So these are pretty impressive structures that were built. This one's called the Cliff Palace, and it was built in these dates, 450 to 1300 CE. This is just another view of it. So one thing that's really interesting about the people that built these structures is that they built these round, what are called kivas, K-I-V-A. So these are round rooms, you could say, that are pretty much underground, and you have to enter them through a hole in the roof originally. And nobody really knows why they were built this way. It's possible that they were a kind of fortification that could easily be defended, in that if you get in your kiva and some other hostile group is trying to overrun your city, they have to come. The only way they can get to you is by coming down a ladder. And you could sort of pick them off one by one coming down the ladder, right? That may also be why these structures are built high up on these cliffs above the canyon floor where the corn and beans and squash were grown, was that they were kind of like forts, maybe city forts, so to speak. But not everybody from these cultures lived in cliff dwellings. There were other sites that were just more like what the Hopi people live in now, which are called pueblos, made out of adobe or stone and adobe. And there were ceremonies that were conducted in these round kivas, these sort of underground kivas, but people also lived in them. So this is one of the kivas, with a fire pit and a vent for the air, and then a kind of stone deflector so that cold air wouldn't bother you too much coming in for the fire. And then all these benches that so you could sit around this fire, and then the roof would be supported by these piers, sort of. So it was probably a very cozy and kind of mystical place to hang out, I would think. And some of them have paintings on the walls that suggest that same cosmology that we were talking about, where there's the earth realm and the sky realm, the realm of the thunder god and of lightning and thunder, and the underworld, maybe. This is just another view of Mesa, another structure at Mesa Verde, which you can visit now as a tourist. So Mesa Verde was, and Chaco Canyon and those other sites were suddenly abandoned around the year 1300. Mesa Verde had only been there. It was built like 100 years prior. So people only lived there for about 100 years before they abandoned it, which is kind of weird because it's an elaborate structure that obviously took a lot of time and effort to build. And there's a lot of theories about why these structures were abandoned. One of them, the most convincing one to me, is that there was a decades-long mega drought that lasted 50 years in the desert Southwest. And we know that because of the tree analysis of the tree rings. And it's possible that people could no longer sustain these large cities and that there was famine. And there's even been some suggestion that there was massive warfare and even cannibalism during this period, so that people were fleeing each other, basically. But it's not that they just disappeared. They became the Navajo and Hopi people eventually. Oops, wrong direction. Okay, so this is a slide from Chaco Canyon, which I did visit in the early, I think it was 2008. I went to Chaco Canyon, and it's a very impressive structure with some of the most beautiful masonry you've ever seen in your life. That is this stone masonry. And there's these huge apartment houses. It's some of the buildings are built sort of on a cliff, but most of them are just built above the canyon floor. So you can see the floor of the canyon down below you, and it's all grown up now with trees and things. But when we were there, the literature that you get when you go to the Chaco Canyon site suggested that that's where their farming happened, down there at the base of the canyon, where they grew their corn and beans and squash. And these were fairly large cities, and apparently there were, or towns you could say, and there was trade all up and down the canyon between these cities. But you could also climb out of the canyon. There's stairs going up the walls of the canyon to the top. And then there were more roads and paths that connected people to towns all over the Southwest. So it was a big culture, just like, Cookeville is connected to Livingston and Allgood and Gordonsville and Carthage. So these cities, these people all knew each other and traded amongst themselves, and even possibly traded with people in Latin America. And I'll talk about the evidence for that in a minute. But one thing that's kind of unique about these structures is these beautiful doorways. And again, it's not clear exactly why they're built this way, except possibly for defensive reasons. I mean, only one person can go through here at a time, right? So if you were being invaded, you could guard this doorway and just pick off each person as they came through. Why it's wide here at the top, I don't know, except maybe they had bundles that people carried. There was no real, people didn't have donkeys or even alpacas to carry like they did in South America. They had alpacas as beasts of burden. But one of the things about the people of North America that is very different from Europe and Africa and Asia was they basically didn't have much in the way of domesticated livestock. They had dogs, but they didn't get horses until Europeans came. Which is kind of funny to think about because we imagine Plains Indians as being these wonderful horsemen, and they were, but they acquired horses after the Spanish conquistadors came and brought horses to Mexico and so on, and then those horses came up into Texas and into the Great Plains, and they captured them and learned to ride them. But before Columbus, there were no horses or donkeys or anything, any beast of burden at all in North America, and very few food crops, really. They were sort of limited to corn, beans, squash, peppers, and tobacco, and a few other things. I think they had tomatoes, maybe. Yeah, tomatoes are a New World crop, and cotton. So anyway, if you get to it, if you ever go to New Mexico, to Albuquerque or someplace like that, make a side trip to Chaco Canyon. I think you'll really enjoy it. So one of the pieces of evidence for the fact that the Chacoan culture was in contact with people in what we call Mesoamerica, was the existence of remains of a kind of parrot called the macaw. So macaws are not native to North America, but they found skulls and bones of macaws at Chaco Canyon and other sites. And so it seems that there was this huge culture of feathers in Mexico, among the Aztecs, and before that, amongst the Teotihuacan inhabitants. And there were craftsmen who built these elaborate feathered headdresses for priests and kings to wear at ceremonial events. And apparently, and some of these headdresses also used macaw feathers. These are quetzal feathers. So a quetzal is a type of bird that lives in Belize and Costa Rica, and each bird has 2 long tail feathers. So if they captured enough of these quetzals, they could get enough feathers to make an elaborate headdress. This is one of the things that really impressed Cortez when he arrived in Mexico City, were these amazing headdresses. And in fact, he stole one and took it back to Spain, and it ended up in a museum in Austria, but there's a replica in Mexico City of that headdress. So the Chaco Canyon people also thought this was wonderful, and apparently they imported macaw birds to New Mexico to raise them, specifically to get the feathers, to make feathered headdresses of this sort. So this is part of the arts of North America that is very fragile, and there could have been any number of beautiful objects that people in Chaco Canyon and in Mississippian culture made that have just rotted away or disappeared for one reason or another. Some of them from Mexico survived because the conquistadors wrote about them and took them. So we know that those existed, but there's many more that were probably destroyed by the conquistadors or just lost over time. So there's a lot of things about the art of North America and Mesoamerica that we don't know because of disasters that destroyed those works of art. Okay, so this shows you a map of these sites: Mesa Verde in Colorado, Chaco Canyon, and Canyon de Chelly. And you can see that Chaco Canyon in particular, this is the canyon. These are the rivers that run through these canyons that the people use to irrigate their crops, because this is a pretty arid part of the world. It doesn't rain very much. All right, so now we're jumping to a completely other continent, Africa. And again, this is the art of Africa is a huge, gigantic topic, like the continent itself. There are many different peoples and languages and cultures in Africa, and there's no way to do justice to it in a short lecture like this, but I'm going to try. I'm going to show you a few things. And again, you can on your own, investigate more of the material at the Khan Academy site, in addition to the stuff that I put in the content. Okay, so first I'm just going to talk about some concepts in African art before I talk about specific people and cultures. So one concept that we think about when we're looking at art of any sort is the form and the meaning. So I think we talked about this in one of the first lectures of this course. So the form is just the formal qualities that we see in this sculpture and what is its meaning. That's kind of the iconography that we have to learn. So you can see that this is, the form is pretty abstract. It's not, it's a woman, we know because of her prominent breasts, but it's not naturalistic. It's not representational. And a lot of, there is African art that is naturalistic, but a lot of it is pretty abstract. And that's what made it so interesting to Europeans of the early 20th century, even if they didn't understand how it functioned within African culture, they adored it for its abstract qualities, especially people like Picasso and Matisse, who changed their whole style after their encounter with African art. Anyway, this figure is seated and she's holding a baby in front of her. Basically, its meaning is women are nurturers. Women, it's about women's procreative ability, which is a sort of common theme in the sculpture that we're going to look at today. Some people believe that these is from Mali, which is in West Africa, but there's a lot of different cultures of Mali. This is specific to the Bamana people. Mali's a really interesting country that's having a kind of hard time right now. So keep Mali in your thoughts, because it was once one of the centers of African learning and culture. And right now it's having a lot of problems due to Islamic extremists. And a lot of its learning and its books in particular had to be just evacuated to save them from these Islamic extremists, even though the books were about Islam. Apparently they were planning to destroy them, but they were whisked away and preserved, fortunately, and hopefully they'll be able to be returned to the people of Mali at some time. So that some people think that the Bamana people use this as an aid to conception. Like, let's suppose you were having trouble getting pregnant, that a sculpture like this had a kind of spiritual power that could help you conceive. So a lot of African sculpture, most African sculpture, you could say, is not merely decorative. It's not art for art's sake. It serves a kind of social and religious and spiritual purpose. So this one's from Côte d'Ivoire, which is on the west coast of Africa, and it's a couple, a male and female couple. So this is the male and this is the female person. And again, it's very abstract. It's not representational, but according to what I read about it, it's about women as founders of matrilineal lineages, which is an important thing in a lot of African cultures. Not all. Some African cultures are intensely patriarchal. I just read a book by Trevor Noah called Born a Crime, about his upbringing in South Africa. And his mother married a man who was from a very patriarchal South African culture, and she had a really hard time sort of adapting to that because that wasn't the way she was raised. So there, what I'm saying is there's a lot of diversity in African cultures, but one theme is women as founders of lineages, you could say. Like, your identity comes from your mother and her mother and your grandmother and so on. And also as protectors of male initiates. So that may be what this figure represents here. So initiation is another theme in African art. both male and female initiations in some cultures. When you get to a certain age, you're initiated, sometimes in a pretty harsh and terrifying way. If you've ever read anything about Nelson Mandela, he describes his own initiation into manhood at the age of 9 or 10 or whatever in a pretty awful way. I mean, it has to do with circumcision and things like that. So, but that's part of the San tradition that he grew up in. Okay. All right. So this word should be familiar to you, reliquary, because we talked about European reliquaries, that is boxes that contain the relics of saints and so on. So this is a figure that's part of a reliquary that held the bones of an ancestor. So the African art sometimes is about rites of passage, as I just said. I don't know if I use that term. And I said initiation, but rites of passage is has to do with birth, coming of age, and death. So the bones of an ancestor could be in a box, the reliquary, and then this figure, this female figure, would be part of the reliquary and attached to it. So the figure is not a portrait of an ancestor, but honors the power of the relics, the bone relics. So a lot of times, another thing about African art that I've noticed just in my study of it is a lot of times it has a very smooth and shiny surface, the sculpture. And apparently that happens over time. People rub the sculptures with oil, sometimes with milk, sometimes with blood, and they acquire this kind of patina of age that has to do with their use as ceremonial objects. This is the same one that I just showed you, but from another point of view. So this, and that you can see that it's not naturalistic. The proportions of the body are not realistic, right? This is what was so mind-blowing to European artists who in the early 20th century were trying to break away from sort of Renaissance naturalism, because a Western art or European art had been sort of stuck in a rut for 400 years almost of this sort of Renaissance tradition. And these early 20th century artists like Picasso and Matisse and Derain and other people really wanted a way out. And this sort of art from Oceania and Africa, they didn't know much about North American art, was a way out. It was a way to represent the figure that was different and maybe more meaningful. So that's just sort of an aside. That's a whole other topic for another time in a different lecture. In this lecture, we're going to consider the objects as they functioned in the culture of the people who made them, not as they were considered by 20th century Europeans. But that's very interesting. And I have a 2-volume book about that I'm reading. But I just don't have time to talk about that. This is the only slide where I'm going to talk about that. Okay, so one of the types of objects that knocked European socks off were these masks, so-called masks. But they're not masks in the sense that you put them over your face, usually. You wear them on your head, and then your face is covered with something, raffia usually, so you can see out if you're wearing it. And you're taller, the figure then that you're representing is taller than most people. We'll see. Well, I'll just show you the slide now. We'll come back to this slide. Okay, so this is supposed to represent a female figure. These are her breasts. And there's a dancer wearing this on his head. And his head is kind of covered up by this shawl and a raffia skirt. And he dances the figure of this female ancestor, you could say, in the Baga people culture of Guinea, which is on the west coast of Africa, part of West Africa. And it's called a Dimba mask. So when you see it in a museum, it looks like this, and you're like, what are these legs or what? But no, this fits over your head if you're the dancer. And it represents kind of like a female ancestor, an older woman. So that's the reason her breasts are kind of flat. She's had many children. She's nursed many children. She's a matriarch of her family. She's a mature woman, and her face represents that maturity. So she has a fancy hairstyle, a sort of, she has braids going back from her face, but then she also has this kind of crest on the top of her head that apparently symbolizes prestige or beauty in some way. She's like a lot of African sculptures of head, she has ritual scarification. So some people in Africa would purposely scar their faces to make them more beautiful, and sometimes as part of an initiation ceremony. So she's supposed to look wise and beautiful and be kind of revered as an ancestor. She's tall, almost like a kind of a goddess. She's taller than everybody else in this figure, in this group. But not all African sculpture is abstract like this. A lot of it is, but some of it is a lot more naturalistic, even idealized naturalism, which was the phrase that I used when I was talking about the ancient Greeks a lot. And this comes from Nigeria. And again, within Nigeria, there are many different cultures and peoples, because one thing about Africa generally, the lines that separate countries in Africa are very arbitrary and were created by mostly by colonial powers during the so-called Age of Discovery, when Europeans were sort of dividing up Africa between them as colonies. So, they drew some lines in Nigeria and said, okay, this is Nigeria. But within those lines were people who were from the ancient culture of Benin and other people who were Yoruba people. I mean, there were all these different peoples within Nigeria, and the same is true for just about every African culture, African country. There's many tribes within that culture that speak different languages and have different traditions. So the Yoruba people had a capital that was called Ife. And there's a video at the Khan Academy site about where a guy, an African person who grew up near there, talks about Ife and the whole culture of it. And it was kind of like a court. That is, there was a king and an elaborate court, and these heads were made in association with that court. And as you can see, that it's a very beautiful and calm, expressive face. That sort of having your mouth closed and having a very calm expression of your face on your face was emblematic of nobility, being a good person. And it's possible that the lines on the face referenced scarification too. This is a terracotta head, not a bronze. There were bronze heads from Nigeria too, but this is terracotta. That is, it's made out of clay. And so, we can't overgeneralize about African art and say it's all abstract or anything like that, because there's definitely these very naturalistic heads that predate the colonial era. Okay, so I saved them what to me is the most striking figure for the last. So this was made in the late 19th century. That is after Africa had been sort of overrun and colonized by European powers. But there's no doubt that these kinds of figures had been made for centuries in Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, by the Congo people. So the Democratic Republic of Congo is another country in Africa that is currently experiencing a lot of violence and war. So those people are having a really hard time right now. But they and it's large. A lot of people, scholars, believe that the disruption of colonial powers and the colonization of places like the Congo by the Belgians, in the case of the Congo, just is part of the war and horror that's going on in the Congo now. Is really kind of a legacy of the colonial era. But be that as it may, when Europeans came to the Congo, they encountered these figures, and of course the missionaries wanted to destroy all of them as being demonic, but some of them were collected by Europeans and brought back to Europe. And I think this one might be in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. But anyway, it's an Inkizi Nkandi, which is a sort of loosely translated as a power figure. And I think, if you've been to New Orleans, you've seen and you've gone in like a tourist gift shop, you might have seen something kind of like this, because there's this idea that in New Orleans, there were so-called witch doctors who put pins in dolls and so on. So there's no doubt that this idea of sticking pins in a figure did come from Africa, that it's part of, and that voodoo itself is a sort of descendant of African beliefs about spirituality. But those dolls in the gift shop are probably misunderstood. I don't really know. But I'm going to tell you what I've read about the Inkizi Nkandi, which is pretty interesting, I think. So basically, it's a container of sacred objects, herbs and things. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that it's hollow. So the person who sort of owned it or managed it, the Nganga, who was a kind of shaman, could put things in there. And then this was sealed by a piece of glass or mica. So the things that were put inside there gave it its power, sort of like a medicine bundle in Native American religion. Now, while the blades and nails and things, so what it functioned as a kind of dispute resolving object. So if you had a dispute with somebody and you came to some sort of agreement about it, like, okay, the boundary goes between that tree, and that side is your cornfield, and this side is my cornfield. If you come to an agreement with your neighbor about something like that, you go to the Nganga, you each lick one of the nails and you drive it in there, or a little blade or something. And that's like taking an oath that I'm going to respect the fence line here. And you can't break the oath, because if you do, the Inkizi Nkandi will come after you. So it had that kind of power to sort of intimidate you to keep your agreements. So the Nganga, you could say, functioned almost like a judge who would hear people's disagreements or whatever and adjudicate them. And then everybody would sign on the dotted line, so to speak, by sticking a nail or piece of metal in that thing. So my notes say it's an oath-taking image, but it's also an avenger. So don't break your oath, okay? Otherwise, this thing will come after you. But you can see why Europeans, especially artists, were fascinated by these figures. It looks, to the surrealists, for example, which we're going to study later, the face looked like as if it were in some sort of anguish. The thing about Europeans and their appropriation of these objects is that they didn't understand how the objects functioned in the culture that the object came from. And to be honest, a lot of them didn't really care. It was more about the formal qualities the way the object kind of spoke to them personally. So for a surrealist, it was an image of modern angst in some way. And you can see why. It sort of affects me that way too when I first see it. Now that I know what it's about, I understand it differently, sort of, but I still feel like it's like almost like Munch's The Scream. Ah, it functions sort of as a surrealist object in a way, I think. So, and in the same way, Picasso, when he saw figures like this, Picasso went to a museum in Paris called the Trocadero and saw some figures like this around 1906 or so, at a time when his friends were also interested in these objects and were collecting them. And Picasso understood them kind of viscerally, according to this book I'm reading by William Rubin. That is, he understood that they were power figures, that they had a kind of spiritual power and meaning. And Picasso apparently was kind of afraid of the spirit world himself. Like he was kind of more of he wasn't really a Christian, you could say. He was more like a pagan. And he kind of believed in the spirit world and was both in awe of and afraid of the figures that he saw in the Trocadero. So in that sense, he related to them the way they were meant to be related to, but he wasn't an anthropologist. He didn't try to understand them the way they functioned in their own culture. So, and I don't know if that's good or bad. I mean, it's interesting to know how they functioned in the cultures that they came from, and that's how we should initially approach them, I think. But I think it's also fair to just appreciate them for their formal qualities, and if you're an artist, to use those qualities in your own work, because that's what artists do. We steal things. We steal ideas from other artists, and it's fine. So, okay, that's pretty much all I have to say about pre-Columbian and African art. And I'm sorry I don't really know any more about it than I do. But if I did, I would have to make 2 or 3 lectures instead of one. So this is the end. I'm going to turn the recording off.